Okay. Good morning, everyone. So I'm going to take you through the journey of past 1.5 years and the research we have done in the field of dry eye disease. I'm going to talk about the involvement of lacrimal gland in these patients, a bit about the meibomian glands in the ongoing clinical research and our future plan. So many of you have asked me this question that why, how come I'm a trained oculoplastic consultant? How come I am into the field of dry eye disease? And why am I working on the glands? So just a brief about the history that after finishing my fellowship, I moved to my home city and I was working in very close collaboration with the cornea specialists. So I used to get a lot of these ocular surface patients where you can see that they have a severe form of dry eye disease. And one day a patient asked me if why there are no tears in my eyes. I said because the glands are not producing. And he said, why the glands are not producing any tears? Because I had sloughing of my skin and redness. I didn't have anything to do with the glands. And I was like, yeah, why, how the glands are involved in these patients with cicatrizing conjunctivitis, Stevens-Johnson syndrome. And I averted the upper eyelid and I looked at the area of the palpebral lobe of lacrimal gland where I found some form of scarring. Now to proceed with what is happening at the microscopic level in these glands, I performed a biopsy in 3 patients. Here you can see the gland which has a little whitish area of keratinization and another area which is inflamed. So when I performed the biopsies, I was surprised to see that there are still lacrimal gland acini, but the secretion is zero on the surface. So why it is happening? And we published our case series in the Cornea Journal, and then Dr. Sain came across this paper and he had, as he said, that he started working on the dry eye disease research and he was looking for a research person to work in the field of lacrimal glands. And that's how our collaboration began. So a very brief about for the researchers, the lacrimal glands, the normal lacrimal glands, this is an MRI of the face. You can see this is the eye. And these are almond-shaped structures located in the supratemporal orbit. And these 2 glands, they drain through the ducts onto the surface. Okay. And what happens in cicatrizing conjunctivitis is that the surface gets scarred. So maybe the ducts are getting blocked, but nobody knew that what is happening with these glands within them at the histological level, at the microscopic level. So when I joined in January 2020, the only knowledge I had about lacrimal gland was that it is a gland, so it will have some acini which are producing their secretions, and it has ducts. So these ducts have these pinkish secretions which are drained onto the surface via main duct. And there are some cells which help in pushing and propelling those secretions onto the ocular surface. That is all I knew about lacrimal gland when I joined in Jan 2020. So I thought it will be a good exercise to know what all is already written and established in the literature about the lacrimal gland. And we wrote this review in 2020, where we analyzed the history of lacrimal gland as well. That it began almost 3000 BC, where they used to think that the tears, they come from heart. The heart is pumping everywhere blood, and in the eye it filters and it pumps tears. Then there was a theory of a source of CSF as a source of tear. It is coming through the optic nerve. Around the nerve, where the subarachnoid space, it goes onto the surface and tears are secreted. So the advantage of writing this paper and reviewing all of the history was that we came to know about the lacunae, existing lacunae in the field of understanding of lacrimal gland function. So first lacunae we understood is how do we evaluate the lacrimal gland? I'm sure all of us are doing Schirmer test, and it's been traditionally described since 1903. And in and out we perform, we just put a Schirmer strip. We don't pay much attention to the blinking, the reflex tearing, and the high variability seen in this test. So the Schirmer test is no doubt one of the easiest to perform, but it has a very poor reliability and repeatability. TIA meniscus will tell you about the volume of the conjunctival cul-de-sac. It doesn't measure only the lacrimal gland function. And tear osmolarity is again an indirect function of just the osmolarity of the tears. It doesn't tell you how what changes are happening in the lacrimal gland in dry eye patients. So is there a way we can directly examine the glands? So when I was working in OPD with Dr. Sain in 2020, we started looking at the palpebral lobes of these patients. So it's very easy to do. You are on the slit lamp, you ask the patient to look infero nasally, and this palpebral lobe is prolapsed. And we started looking at the lobes in various types of dry eye disease. So this is a normal appearance. You can see that the lobe is convex. It has a smooth surface and overlying normal conjunctival vessels. This was a patient in Sjogren's syndrome where you can see that the contour has been lost. It's more of flat. And there is a subconjunctival fibrosis in the form of these whitish strands. This is another patient where you can see it has become smaller in size. And there is increased vascularity over the conjunctiva. And when we looked at another form of dry eye, which is in Stevens-Johnson syndrome, we found that many of them had cicatrization in the fornices and you couldn't make out any palpebral lobes. But again, there were many variations seen within the SGS patients. Here you can see that the gland is seen, but it's very vascularized, inflamed. And the Schirmer secretion is still 35. In the second panel here, you can see that there is a subconjunctival fibrosis. The half of the gland is still looking reddish, which might be responsible for secreting 16 millimeters. And especially in this photograph, if you can see that there's a focal area of uninvolved lacrimal palpebral lobe gland area. Rest of the area, you can see the fibrosis and the scarring happening. And only this area was secreting actively the tear formation, which was responsible for 5 mm. So once we had this knowledge of the different types of morphologies we are seeing of the palpebral lobe, we categorized it on the basis of size, shape, convex or flat, presence of scarring, and the vascularization degree. And we could actually differentiate between the patients who have, just by looking at the gland, who have evaporative dry eye versus aqueous deficiency dry eye. Now, once we have seen the morphology, we wanted to directly see how the tears are secreted from these glands. So once you review the literature from the major review, I found that people have described a test where they just touch the fluorescent and the secretion pops out. But the quantification of how can we quantify and objectively measure the amount of secretion and have an idea about the functionality of the gland is the redesigning which we did for this test. So we give it the acronym Dynamic Assessment of Tear Secretion. And thanks to Dr. Sain for that. And it's a very simple test. You just, on the exposed lobe, you touch the fluorescent strip. And you see these tear secretions coming directly from the gland. Now, once you have seen these secretions, you can quantify into 3 areas. You can calculate the tear flow per area, per ductile area, and combine them to have a tear flow per gland. You need ImageJ software for that. You can count the number of ductular opening per gland. You can have the assessment of time lag. In time lag, what is the time lag is that you touch the fluorescent strip, you take it off, and you see how long it takes for the secretions to come up. Normally, it was within less than 1 second the secretions were coming. So then we performed this test in a various subsets of dry eye patients, normal, evaporative dry eye, and aqueous deficiency dry eye. And what we found was that evaporative and normal had almost similar amount of secretion and the tear flow rate, but it was significantly reduced in patients with aqueous deficiency dry eye. Now, within aqueous deficiency dry eye, there was a difference seen in patients who have Sjogren's syndrome, which is an autoimmune form, versus Stevens-Johnson syndrome, which is a cicatrizing conjunctivitis. The difference we found is that this test doesn't only differentiate between normal and EDE and aqueous deficiency dry eye, but within aqueous deficiency dry eye, cicatrizing conjunctivitis patients had less number of ducts as well as less number of tear flow per ductule. And when we correlated this test with the Schirmer's value, we found a good correlation with aqueous deficiency dry eye, but in patients with evaporative dry eye, there was a poor correlation with the Schirmer's test, which means that the direct assessment of lacrimal gland is more accurate to differentiate between EDE and the aqueous deficiency dry eye patients. Another interesting finding which we incidentally found was that the top panel is of a normal gland. At 1 second, you can see secretion immediately coming out. 3 seconds, it's becoming diffuse. But in patients with ADD, the delay was more. So it took more time for secretions to come even after you have applied the fluorescent strip, which means that there is some sensory secretor dysfunction which is happening, that the signal is taking more time to reach from your touch to the brain and back to the gland to secrete. So ADEDE patients have a secretomotor disinnervation as well. We published our results in BGO 2021. While doing this test, we came across this confusion of whether the lacrimal gland is a basal secretor or it is a reflex secretor. It's an ongoing debate that some people feel it's only a reflex secretion, that it doesn't contribute to the basal secretion of the tears. So we did a small experiment in 10 eyes where we touched parakins of bud onto the palpebral lobe for 1 minute, 30 seconds, and then we checked the secretions before and after anesthesia with the parakin. And what we found was that the tear flow rate was definitely reduced significantly, but it didn't disappear altogether. So it has a component of both basal as well as a reflex secretor in our opinion. And we published this result in Cornea Journal. So to summarize so far, what we have seen is that a structural as well as functional assessment of lacrimal gland, which can be done directly, can easily differentiate between patients who are normal, patients who have dry eye disease versus healthy individuals, and different types of aqueous deficiency dry eye disease, and it has a good repeatability. So while we were doing this test, we came across, as all of you know, that Sjogren's syndrome patients, they have involvement of salivary glands as well. So they have a complaint of something like dry mouth along with dry eye. So we performed this test to measure the secretions of labial minor salivary glands. So we just tried this experiment by touching the fluorescent strip onto the everted lower lip. And here you can see these secretions popping out, which are indicative of minor salivary glands. This was the first time we described this test. So far, the secretion of minor salivary gland has been tested by using, a complex Peritron machine, where they secrete the whole of the saliva, or they use specific gravity-based calculations. So this was a very easy to do, and we had a normative data first. So we assessed individuals between various decades from 20 years to 60 years of age, and we found that the numbers and the flow reduces with age. These are the lower lip of some of the patients who have Stevens-Johnson syndrome. And you can see that the secretions are well preserved. And there was no difference from the age-matched normals. Whereas in patients who were Sjogren's syndrome, the secretions were reduced in the number as well as the flow rate from the minor salivary glands. So if a patient walks in your clinic and you suspect a diagnosis of aqueous deficiency dry eye, and a patient that has a vague history of dry mouth, doesn't complain much, and you see that the lacrimal gland is inflamed, small in size, has reduced secretion, you can perform this test in your OPD itself, and you see if the number of salivary glands openings have reduced, which will give you an indicative that this patient might have a Sjogren's syndrome. So then we started doing, we did a correlation between the Schirmer's and the minor salivary gland flow rate. Like if a patient has a Schirmer which is reduced, does it mean every patient will have a reduction in or normal minor salivary gland flow rate? We found there was no correlation. So you have to separately check the activity of the lower labial salivary glands along with the dry eye evaluation using the lacrimal gland activity in these patients. We published our results in the journal Seminars in Ophthalmology. Now, once we have seen the normal salivary glands in the lip, we in the OPD, we came across a follow-up of various patients where the minor salivary gland transplant has been done. So these two are the two different patients that were panel. It shows that this is a transplanted graft in the superior bulbar conjunctiva, where you can see a good uptake of the graft. It is pinkish, and in continuity with the adjacent tissue, this is a little more inflamed in appearance compared to the case one. And then we touched in the same manner, we just directly touched a moistened fluorescent strip onto the surface of the graft. Till now, no direct assessment of transplanted graft was possible. We used to use the indirect test of Schirmer's or ocular surface staining. So once we touch, we can see these three secretory openings, which is indicating that this graft in real time is actually secreting the secretion from the salivary, transplanted salivary glands. Whereas in case 2, even repeated touch onto the graft didn't induce any secretion from this graft. So though this graft structurally looks being uptaken at that site, but it's not functionally active. And we publish our results in as a letter to editor in Cornea Journal. So before proceeding further, I'll ask if anyone has any questions.
Yeah, I posted my question in the chat box. Mainly it was that, can be in your data, because most of the patients would come to us in a severe stage to tertiary center or center of excellence. Do we know the time course of these changes, whether we can differentiate in early phase or only in late phase, and how much of difference would be there? How does it, do we have patients which we have followed who came to us very early, and then does it change? Would the
Yeah.
treatment alter if they had treatment, not had treatment?
Actually, we had very in cases of like Steven Johnson syndrome, we had very few patients who presented to us in like 2 months from the acute phase, in very early phase. We could see the scarring happening in that area, where we have followed them up, and over a period of time, we are seeing that the secretions are getting reduced. So there is some form of ongoing chronic inflammation happening in these lacrimal glands of especially cicatrizing conjunctivitis patients, and we need to, in subsequent slides I'll discuss about what pathological changes happen and how can we intervene and at what level can we intervene. As far as Sjogren's syndrome patients are concerned, usually we use this test to follow them up. Suppose if
So Swati, I guess what in the context of Sjogren's syndrome, what Dr. Subhadra is asking is, I guess, if there is any correlation between, let's say, Schirmer's and which is a surrogate marker for the severity of the disease or the chronicity, and what you see on DATS. So if the Schirmer's is low, what are the changes or what are the differences that you will see on the DATS test and vice versa?
Okay, so I think in Sjogren's syndrome, there's a very good correlation with this test. The advantage that this test has over Schirmer's is, one is less variability. So many times we come across, suppose a patient has walked in and Optum has done the applanation tonometer and he's put the Parakin, and after that he realizes, okay, I have to do the Schirmer's, and he'll put the Schirmer's strip. So under anesthesia, almost 50% reduction happens. And second is, most of these patients are on lubricants and they are on very frequent use of lubricants. So they are, while sitting back in the waiting area, they'll keep using the drops. When they walk in, and Optum doesn't ask if they've used any drops or not, and you put the Schirmer's strip, and the Schirmer's is like 9-10 millimeters, and you look at the gland and you look at, it's a very small in size, it cannot be 10. And when again you repeat it after 1 hour, it comes to 4 or 5. So I think it's the less variability and a direct assessment possible with tests, which are the advantages in Sjogren's syndrome. To have a longitudinal follow-up of these patients with this test is yet to be done.
So my question was, like, you showed that, you can differentiate the two diseases by your DATS test, but those patients would have come to us in relatively advanced disease. So what I'm trying to say is that in the very early phase of the diseases, will these tests still show a significant difference or not?
Yes.
And do we have patients in both the groups where they have come very early? I guess we would have very difficulty to get those patients in our centers.
I agree, because the referral center will have in the end stage. But yes, there are cases where they were in early disease. They were not diagnosed as Sjogren's syndrome. They presented first time. And Sjogren's syndrome itself can also cause cicatrizing conjunctivitis. And when we looked at the gland, we could differentiate, okay, this is smaller in size and it has reduced secretion. The number of openings have reduced. So can be Sjogren's syndrome. And when we ordered the autoimmune workup, and we found that there was positivity for these antibodies. So yes, they'll be less, but we have seen patients in early disease. In SGS,
in early disease, if I can summarize, and then we can move on, take to some of the questions later. In early disease, what we have seen, Dr. Subhadra, is like Swati mentioned, there are multiple parameters that you can measure. It's not just the how much of tears is flowing out, but also the delay. Like you touch the Schirmer's strip, and when does the gland start secreting, the response time. So one of the things that we see in early disease is, even though the amount of secretion may be normal overall that you measure, but the response time is slower than normal. So it's not immediate, like you touch it and briskly aqueous flows out, or tears flow out. It takes a little bit of time. So that is an early indicator, which is actually quite an insightful fact.
Okay, so I think I'll proceed with the presentation. So now what happens to these glands in dry eye patients, and how can we go back to the original state of the glands? So what we know from the literature is that it's been well established that in Sjogren's syndrome patients or who have autoimmune involvement due of the form of dry eye, there's a more of lymphocytic infiltration within the glands, which damages the acini as well as the ducts. But what is happening in SGS patients, it's not it's never been studied before. So we performed biopsies from the lacrimal glands of patients who have zero tear secretion on Schirmer's, and we assess the orbital lobe and palpebral lobe separately. So if you look at this slide, in SGS patient, you can see that these acini are kind of become blotted and very bigger in size, and you can see there's a retention of secretion compared to normal acinar appearance. And there was a very variability seen in these glands. Here you can see the nuclei are well preserved, but there is still distortion of the acini with some form of atrophic changes happening in one or two areas. And these all are chronic SGS patients, and in very few patients we found a form of lymphocytic infiltration. So we did the special staining of with the various secretory markers as well as inflammatory markers. And here you can see lactoferrin, which is a component of aqueous. We can see it's a very intense staining within the gland. That means that there is a retention of the secretions happening within the acini of these patients, despite the normal appearance of the myoepithelial cells and the acinar cells, and there are foci of infiltration with CD20 positive lymphocytes. However, when we perform the biopsies from the palpebral lobe of the lacrimal gland, which is in direct contact with the conjunctiva, here you can see this is one ductule visible, and there's a lot of periductular fibrosis, intense form of fibrosis which you can see around the duct, and there's no secretion remaining within the lumen or in the epithelial cells. So there's a periductular fibrosis happening in palpebral lobe, and there's a different degree of reduction of the expression of secretory markers within these glands. Now, aquaporin is a water channel which secretes the aqueous from the acinar epithelial cell into the lumen, and because of the retention of the secretion, the channels were found within the cytoplasm rather than onto the surface of the epithelium. So this was clear that these glands are undergoing changes secondary to the obstruction which is happening onto the ocular surface, and they have ongoing fibrosis, more changes in the palpebral lobe, and retention of the secretions. So in few of the samples, we also performed transmission electron microscopy, where we can see the ultrastructural details of the acinar as well as ductal cells. So here the top panel is of a normal lacrimal gland. Here you can see a nuclei which has heterochromatin, euchromatin, electron dense secretory vacuoles within the epithelial cells. And whereas in SGS patient, these nuclei, they have lost the differentiation of chromatin. There are no dark areas you can see within the nuclei now. So the nuclei was lost. There was a loss of chromatin differentiation within these cells, and the myoepithelial cells had lost their processes, secretory processes. And within the lumen, you can see these empty vesicles. Instead of these electron dense vesicles, which are dark black in color, here you see empty vesicles within the lumen. So there were secretions, but not composed of electron dense material, which is seen in a normal gland. So ultrastructurally also, this gland is undergoing a lot of changes secondary to pathology ongoing onto the ocular surface. Now we have seen that the gland has inflammation along with the damage. So we came across a very incidental finding of EP3 receptors within the lacrimal glands. As you know that we had an ocular surface publication on the lid margin keratinization, where we described the histological changes and proposed the pathophysiology of this disease. So there was a lot of inflammation happening in these lid margins, and we wanted to do a study of why there is an ongoing chronic inflammation within these lid margins. So when we reviewed the literature, we found that in SGS patients, the prostaglandin E2 receptor, prostaglandin E2 is anti-inflammatory, so it protects you from the inflammation. So prostaglandin E2 receptor 3 was reduced in SGS patients, but in chemical injury or other ocular surface disease, it was normally expressed. So we wanted to test this receptor within the lid margin, and what we found incidentally was this is a sagittal section of a normal eyelid. So we wanted to have a control expression of PGE2 in the lid margin, and we found that the accessory lacrimal glands are very strongly positive. So we reviewed the literature and we found that there were no description of EP3 receptor within the lacrimal glands. So for first time, we evaluated the expression of EP3 within the normal lacrimal glands. We found there was a strong and diffuse nuclear expression of these EP3 receptors, which is anti-inflammatory, and the ducts didn't have any expression of EP3. Accessory lacrimal glands also had a very beautiful expression of EP3 receptor. And when we checked this expression in SGS gland, they was lost. So maybe the loss of EP3 expression is something unique to the Stevens-Johnson syndrome patients. And this propagates the ongoing chronic inflammation we see in these patients. So the lacrimal gland in SGS patients, they have histologically retention of secretions. There is ongoing periductal fibrosis. They have loss of EP3 receptor, which may be linked to the chronic inflammation seen in these glands, and they undergo ultrastructural damage. Now, once we have seen the damage, how can we prevent it? So there are two stages where you can act, either in acute stage or in chronic phase. So prevention in acute stage would require, we have seen now the scarring happening in the palpebral lobe area. So maybe when we are doing ocular surface AMG in acute stage, we should tuck in the AMG more deeper into the palpebral lobe area so that the symblepharon and scarring doesn't happen in the area of draining ductules. That is number one. In chronic phase, what we can do is maybe we can use anti-inflammatory or anti-fibrotic therapy. So we explored the use of 5-FU injection. This is the palpebral lobe area where you can see a symblepharon adjacent to it, and there's a lot of surface scarring. We injected 0.1 cc of 5-FU into it. We see that the symblepharon has reduced, flattened a little bit, and the gland inflammatory appearance has changed marginally. So we did a pilot study where we tested the effect of 5-FU onto the tear secretion as well as the morphological changes in these lobes. And we found that in areas where there was some form of secretion, there was improvement in the appearance as well as the secretory flow of the gland with 5-FU injection. But in glands which had zero secretion, there was no change pre and post injection. So if the gland is functioning, has a little bit of function remain, then this injection can be explored. But in glands where there's a complete fibrosis, it does reduces the inflammation onto the surface of the gland, but the secretory activity remains unchanged. We had very early results with 5-FU injection, and we are yet to have a big data on, a large number study on the 5-FU, effect of 5-FU. So next I have is the involvement of meibomian glands in dry eye patients. So meibomian glands, we have meibography is used now in a big way. Every patient where we suspect has evaporative dry eye, they are carrying these meibography reports where they pass interferometry principle is used to image the structure of the meibomian glands. This vertical running whitish structure from the top of the tarsus to the base are the parallelly placed meibomian glands. On histopathology, you can see them as the sebaceous glands which secrete their secretions into the duct, and they have an expression of PPR gamma. PPR gamma is a protein, is a molecule which regulates the adipogenesis within this gland. So their secretion and the lipid synthesis is regulated by PPR gamma. So there are different morphologies of meibomian glands described on meibography, but we do not know what these morphologies represent histologically. So so you can see that the gland has again suddenly turned upwards, hooked gland. So why this has happened and what it represents, we don't know. So far, no study has been done on the correlation of histology with the morphology of meibomian glands seen on meibography. So we performed a study.
को बाथरूम जाना है हम नीचे जाके आते हैं मैं देना है मेरे को किसी को
Dr. Savitri, your mic is on.
So we performed a study in which I used to go with the iBank on iBank calls, and we had, after obtaining the proper consent, I used to harvest the whole of tarsal plate along with the conjunctiva. So this is one specimen where you can see this is the lid margin. These are the meibomian glands running vertically, and this is the overlying conjunctiva. So get them back, image them using LipiView interferometer, where you can see these glands exactly in the similar morphology, and then process histologically in the same plane where you have seen the mebography in. So you can easily correlate this mebography with the histopathological findings. So where you can see this is a normal appearance. This gland can be seen running vertically, having a good amount of secretion of the fat. And these are the mebum secretion being secreted into the lumen. A strong expression of PPR gamma within the nuclei, and a great Ki67 expression in the nuclei, which indicates that these are normal functioning, actively dividing cells. Now, if you look at the above panel, you can see this is a hooked gland. So what has happened is histologically, you can see the gland being turned, histologically, you can see the gland has turned upwards. Now, why this happens, we do not know. Here, the turn, even after despite turning and all, the morphology of the acini is same as seen in the normal glands. The PPR gamma expression was also same as seen in the normal glands. So hooked glands we found histologically are very similar to the normal meibomian glands. It's just a structural deviation from the normal appearance, which could be present even without any pathology, ongoing pathology within the tarsal plate. Then there are areas of gland dropout. You can see between these two glands, there's a complete dark area. You cannot see a normal gland which should have been present there. So many of the experts around the world propose that this dropout area is actually that it doesn't have any fatty secretion, but there may be some gland, the outline should be there. It's just that it is not secreting, so you cannot see that whitish appearance of the glands. But we found that there was no indication of any gland tissue present in between that area of gland dropout. Then we had, fortunately, few samples where we could see the short glands. So these glands are not reaching till the convex border of the tarsus. These are the short glands which are remaining till the half of the edge. But on histology, the acinar appearance as well as the ductular appearance was similar to the normal glands. Even the PPR gamma expression was strong, and they had actively dividing cells indicated by Ki67 positivity. So even short glands had a similar morphology as the normal glands. However, if you come to very short glands, that is which are less than 1/3 the width of tarsus, we found significant acinar atrophy. Here you can see that the normal sebocytes have lost nuclei. There is increased deposition of this acellular eosinophilic material around the acini, and the thickness has increased, and there is a very poor nuclear expression of PPR gamma in these acini. So these are atrophic acini which are not actively secreting and perhaps are going to die off with the time. Then there are certain areas where you see that the glands are overlapping into each other, where we found that just the width of the acini was increased, but the morphology and the expression was similar. Even in thick glands, we found that there was increase in the thickness of the ductular epithelium, but the secretory activity and the expression of PPR gamma was well preserved. We published our results in BGO this year, and to summarize that, we found hooked, any tortuous gland or short glands, they have similar acinar histology. But severely short glands have atrophic acini, which might not respond to the treatment of various, either meibomian gland expressing devices. Short glands still have remaining active cellular population and activity, so it might be salvageable with the with the therapies like meibomian gland expressibility or your lid massage and other forms of therapy. Whereas gland dropout area, they don't show any glandular tissue, so these are lost. Now, other than this work related to the glandular findings, we are doing a clinical research where we have formed a controlled environment chamber for dry eye studies. This is an established oculus and osmometer inside the chamber. So this control chamber can regulate the temperature, humidity, and the airflow, where you can do controlled studies as well as induced dry eye in some patients, and they see the effect on the ocular surface. So before beginning with the further studies, we wanted to have a normal data for Indian population. So we assessed 474 eyes, where we studied the effect of age, sex, and the different parameters onto the dry eye test. These papers are under review. And then we are very uniquely placed that we have all the diagnostic platforms for dry eye. We have the various companies and machines available in the on the planet. We have them in our dry eye investigation room. So we compared all the 3 different modalities, and we have now come up that Oculus is more reliable than other forms of dry eye diagnostic platform, which now we are going to use for our clinical research. So the next work we are going to do in this is we're going to assess the effect of lubricants in that control chamber by inducing the dry eye, putting a lubricant, and then again checking how it is affecting the tear dynamics. So our future plan is that now we have seen the all damage happening within the glands and the meibomian glands and lacrimal glands. So the future work we want to target is around mesenchymal stem cell use to reverse the changes, or to increase the, or to culture the glands within the in vitro and then transplant them into the human eyes, or use their secretions as a form of dispensed bottle to be used by patients. So we are doing cultures in our lab where we have been able to grow the lacrimal gland epithelial cells, as well as now we are isolating the mesenchymal stem cells from these cultured lacrimal gland tissues. Another work which we have proposed even grants for is to create an animal model of dry eye disease. So there are many rabbit models of dry eye disease, but there's no model of the kind of patients we see with a severe form, where there's a scarring happening in the periglandular area. So what we propose to do is, we have performed the basal work on this, that we've studied the anatomy of the lacrimal glands in rabbit and histology as well, which is very comparable to human glands. Now we're going to proceed with this, that we're going to form 2 models of aqueous deficiency dry eye disease. One is with autoimmune hidradenitis. We're going to use different form, and cicatrizing conjunctivitis model, where we have begun our very early work, where we are using different chemicals, touching them into the area of palpebral lobe of the rabbit eye, and then seeing the changes over a period of 12 weeks. Along with that, we are also, since we now have seen the palpebral lobe area and the secretory openings, we have used DATs in the rabbit eyes, and we have cauterized the glandular openings and seeing if it's inducing any form of periglandular scarring. So in past 1.5 years, our team had more than 20 publications with many papers under review, and it wouldn't have been possible without the support of many researchers working in our stem cell lab, who are always there to collect samples and help us with the studies. Our histology team, Dr. Geeta, who's a collaborator with us, and my dry eye team at the LVPI. Thank you.
Thank you, Swati. So we'll quickly, it goes without saying that it was a great presentation, and I'm always, when I think about how much in terms of quantity, variety, and also quality of work that we have done in the last 1.5 years, I mean, it is truly, it is really, really exemplary. And congratulations. So one of the questions that a couple of people had was on the EP3 staining. I think Dr. Prashant also asked this, and Indumati also asked this, that you showed the lack of EP3 expression in the SJS glands. Do you have any plans, or do you have any data on other aqueous deficiency states like Sjogren's syndrome or other cicatrizing conjunctivitis?
No, we haven't performed any biopsies on the Sjogren's syndrome. We tried 1 or 2 cases, but it's ethically an issue to perform a biopsy where some amount of secretion is left. So in Sjogren's syndrome, we found that if the Schirmer's is 0, we were not finding any glandular tissue. It's a completely atrophied. So we don't have glandular tissue to test EP3 expression. However, in chemical injury where they have 0 secretion, that is one area where we can explore, because they have a similar form of cicatrizing conjunctivitis as kind of in SJS patients. So that is one area we can definitely explore, but we haven't done so far.
Yeah, it's a catch-22 situation, I guess, because in Sjogren's, either they have secretion where taking a biopsy is kind of, it's a difficult call. You don't want to lose that little bit of secretion that you have. And in those cases, where they don't have secretions, where the ethical dilemma is not there. The gland is atrophied to the extent that you are not really able to retrieve any glandular tissue on biopsy. That's the problem there. So that answers the couple of queries on EP3 expression. There was also a question from Dr. Indumati where she asked, in the changes that you showed in the meibomian glands, where you said that glands that are tortuous or that are short but not extremely short or overlapping, the glandular structure is normal, and therefore you're saying that these may be variants of the normal and not necessarily pathological. So she asked that, is it possible that maybe the gland per se is normal, but the duct, the orifice of the duct is blocked? So did you see any blockage at the orifice? So could you have a normal gland and just the orifice being blocked?
Yeah, it's a great question. The actual issue was that when we process these biopsies into the histology, somehow we were not able to see the ductal opening onto the surface on histopathology. And these were like diseased patients. So after cadaveric thing, we cannot even assess it clinically if the meibum expressibility is there or not. So we couldn't have any either clinical or histological correlation with the ductal opening. This will be in future work to go, but what we are doing now is that we have a data from meibography of normal 474 eyes, which we are going to analyze to give us a data that what is a normal distribution of different morphologies within a healthy individuals. So how many glands can be tortuous, but still the patient has no symptoms, the expressibility is very good, it's a healthy individuals. So maybe from that data we'll have an indirect idea of if these glands, the morphologies can be normal as well.
Okay, thanks. So there was one question on the effect of treatment on aqueous deficiency dry eye on lacrimal gland function from our Ananya, who's a cornea fellow, but you have already answered that and showed the 5-issue data. There was another question from Dr. Charanya on, have you looked at, or can you tell us a little bit about how different the salivary gland and lacrimal gland secretions are? How similar or different they are?
So biochemically, I think there's a lot of data where they have assessed the different composition of saliva versus the secretions of the versus tears. So what I am now trying to do is direct proteomic analysis of tears coming from the palpebral lobe. So it's not the conjunctival cul-de-sac volume which you're going to collect, which will have secretions from meibomian glands, goblet cells, and your lacrimal glands. So we want to take directly only the lacrimal gland secretion isolated. There's only one paper where they have assessed and they found there were differences in the proteomic composition of tears versus lacrimal gland secretion. As far as comparison to salivary glands is concerned, I'm sure like there are many papers where they have studied the biochemical composition as well as the other data on this.
There was a question from Payal Sangani who had asked, how do you collect tear? You know, the tear quantity in dry eye patients is very little. So how do you collect enough to assess various things? In tear collection, I think these are well described. One is you can pool tears from both eyes. That's one strategy. And the other strategy that particularly researchers at Narayana Nethralaya have standardized, and they have published in the Ocular Surface very recently, is that you can take a washout. So you can do a lavage with a lubricant and take that to study whatever are the inflammatory cells or the proteins that are secreted in the tears if the tear quantity is very low. So that is also one approach. So you can look at that paper if you're interested in that. She also has a question on, do you have any comment on fecal transplants and gut microbe transplant, particularly in Sjogren's syndrome? So this is, recently Anat Galore from Bascom Palmer had this publication on fecal transplant. She presented also at the ARVO India meeting. So I hope, Payal, you have heard her talk. If you have not, please wait for the, when we share the link for the various keynote lectures and you can revisit her talk. But Swati, if you had a comment on fecal transplantation.
I think they have, the paper is published in ophthalmology, and they have taken the stool flora of the normal healthy individuals and which form to be used. They are yet to come up with that what's an ideal way to transplant those microbial floras into the dry eye patients. So they are doing it per rectally, the route if you want to use and which types of microbes is, they're doing it per rectally, and they're harvesting it from the normal healthy individuals.
So they have shown that there is some benefit that or some changes that they see, but I think there is it's not very reliable or consistent. That's what the drift that I got from a presentation. But they're trying to, I think, figure out how they can improve that. But it's a very interesting concept, because we know that Sjogren's an autoimmune condition, and there is a change in the microbiome of or gut microbiome in autoimmune disease, and if improving that, so it's also a chicken and egg kind of situation. We don't know what is the cause and the effect. So whether the change in the microbiome can also change situation systematically, or is a reflection of the autoimmune disease. So Dr. Indrajit had a question on tear viscosity. So have you had the opportunity, or do you plan to look at, or how can one look at tear viscosity? Would you expect, I'm sure that we would expect some differences in tear viscosity in different dry eye conditions, but is there a way that that can be looked at, or have you?
We have never looked at it, but there are tear rheological studies where they have assessed the viscosity and the tear dynamics and the effect of spread of tears onto the ocular surface. But we have not studied the viscosity.
Okay, great. So we are down to the last 5 minutes or so, and I would like to take this opportunity, first of all, like Swati said, and I said at the beginning, to thank all of the people who have supported us and been a part of this journey so far. So our scientist collaborators, both internal and external, particularly Dr. Vivek Singh and the students in his lab. Now Dr. Arunashri is also working on the microbiome in dry eyes, and we have an excellent group of collaborators externally also we are working on several projects with them. The other thing that I wanted to mention was that I also wanted to thank, and like Swati already did, the technical support that we have received, particularly from the pathology lab. Both Mr. Sridhar and Mr. Naidu and Tirupati, they've all helped us do some of the very difficult sectioning and staining very small, delicate, friable tissue that we are handling here. Also our pathologists, Dr. Dilip Mishra and Soumya, who have collaborated with us. And I hope that they can collaborate more with us on dry eye research. Finally, just to summarize, couple of things and a couple of points that I wanted to make for just the benefit of particularly clinicians who are listening into this presentation. Number one is that I think the template or the approach that Swati has used can be used as a template by many scientists who want to do research beyond just clinical research. And I think that the approach essentially is curiosity based. And while I was listening to Swati's presentation, I was reminded of what Steve Jobs said, I think in 2005 or 6, that stay hungry, stay foolish. So I think we need to have humility about the fact that there are many things that we don't know, instead of assuming that we already know what we know and then moving on from there. So I think the approach that we took, and when we started thinking about what are the ways in which we're going to approach research in dry eye disease, we realized that there are many things that we assume to be true, but nobody's really looked at. Like, for example, what are the actual changes in the lacrimal gland in dry eye? Or the entire assessment of dry eye is predicated on surrogate measurements. Nobody's actually looking at the glands which are affected, or what are the ways in which we can look at the glands. So one of the fantastic things, or I think very interesting things that Swati described, and I think that we have discovered, is that there is a diversity in the morphological appearance of meibomian glands, and everything that we see in meibography is not necessarily pathological. And I think that's a very insightful and profound finding, that are you going to really treat only on the basis of morphological appearance, or do we first need to understand what is the correlation between morphological appearance and the pathological changes that are happening in this gland? And see, the answer that she has found is insightful, profound, but the effort that has gone behind in finding their answer also needs to be appreciated here, because I remember that this was just before COVID last year, where she would go with the eye bank collection, eye donation collection team from the eye bank, take consent from the family members of the deceased, take the biopsies of the eyelids herself. And now she has trained other research students to do that, and they are able to do that very well. And then again, similarly, showing that kind of interest and initiative in collecting biopsies from the OR, etc., to do this. So I hope that this has been, this was extremely illustrative, and I think we had a very engaging discussion as well. And thank you, Swati, for that. And thank you, everybody, for asking so many questions. But I hope that this has been inspiring for all the young clinicians out there also who want to do a little bit more insightful research in their focus area. So I think first you have to understand that Swati is not even from the, is a oculoplast, trained as an oculoplastic surgeon, and an area of interest is dry eye. So, it doesn't stop her from doing her oculoplasty surgical clinical work, but this is an area of focus, an area of interest that she's developed and worked on. And I think all of us can do that if we put our hand up and first say, okay, I'm going to work in this area. And then Swati's approach, and I think all of you take the opportunity of interacting with her to understand what is the approach that you can take to have, humility, to have curiosity, and just do the simple things right. And you can be very productive in your research, and all of that can eventually, generate information and data that can help us in our day-to-day management of patients. So thank you so much, Swati. Thank you so much, everyone, for all the appreciative words, kind words, and also the engaging questions. Thank you.